In order to understand the full significance of the 18th century for the development of British literature, we really also need to look at the economic context in which this literature could develop. And this is what we call the literary market. So we need to take a look at what happened to the literary market, because this is really the period when a market, in the sense that we would understand it today, developed for the first time. We can look at, for example, at book production, at the numbers of books that were being created in and published in the period. And here you have a table with some numbers, and you can see this starts out in the 1710s and goes to the end of the 18th century. And one thing we can see from this is that if we're looking here, we're starting out with 1,705 books, different titles of books that are being published. And if we go to the end of the 18th century, we see that in the span of this century, the yearly production has about doubled. So that tells us a little bit about how the market expands in terms of titles that are being published. But it's of course not only the titles that expand, or that is just sort of a part of the effect of the fact that we have an expanding readership as well. This is just another sort of statistic that gives us, in this case, the illiteracy rate for France. I don't have the same for England, but we can really assume that this is the same thing. And of course, if the illiteracy goes down, that means that literacy goes up. So again, here the starting point is at the beginning of the 18th century, when at least in France there were between 60 and 70% who were illiterate, who could not read or write, and that number goes steadily down. So more and more people are able to read and are able to write, and that is of course an important aspect, because these people are also from different social classes. So it's the middle classes and even the lower classes that gain in literacy and that are interested in different kinds of books. But anyway, once you can read, you want to read. So demand is growing for books, which is one of the reasons why the book production goes up. But still, and I think I mentioned this earlier in a different video, the price for books was very, very high. Price for paper, anything printed on paper, was rather prohibitive. So basically, the price for a book would be up to a month's wages for a normal worker. So you would have to take all the money that you make in a month in order to buy one book. So where to get these books? It wasn't just possible to buy any of the books that you wanted to. Now, and with that comes a change in the organization of libraries. Up till that point, of course, libraries had existed, but libraries were basically a place to secure books. In a way, you hide them from the larger public. You gather them together in one space so you can keep them safe. And of course, there's a limited amount of people who are able to use it. But the books really have to remain in the library. As you can see here on these images, medieval libraries often actually chained the books to the shelves so that they couldn't physically be removed from the library. Now, in contrast to that, what developed in the 18th century was the circulating or lending library. So the library, in the sense that we are familiar with it today, as a place where you can actually get books. You can lend them, you can take them out, read them for yourself, and then bring them back. And that, of course, you could do at a fraction of the cost of buying them. So someone, let's say a servant girl who would never be able to buy a single novel, for a relatively cheap price could get admittance to a lending library, a circulating library, and could read as many books as she had time to. So that drastically, of course, changed the access that particularly the middle and lower classes had to reading material. And there was a lot of anxiety actually in the time about these lending libraries, about the corrupting influence that they would have on the servant classes, because they get to read all of these novels. And in fact, it was mainly novels that were being offered. There is a text from 1797 called The Use of Circulating Libraries. So it's basically sort of a how-to on how to create a lending library. And it basically says, consider that for a successful circulating library, the collection must contain 70% fiction. That's really what people want to read. So this was basically all about reading novels. So this is both the literacy, the rise in production, but also the lending libraries are all very important breeding grounds on which the explosion of novel writing that we will experience are based on, and we need to have that kind of as a foundation to understand what is going on here. So circulating or lending libraries were an important factor in the development of the literary market. Another factor is juridical, because that is the question of on the one hand, censorship, but on the other hand, also copyright. So what happened to censorship at the time? This is something that I mentioned earlier, that one thing that characterizes the 18th century in England is the virtual abolishment of censorship. And that is because censorship was basically organized through the so-called Licensing Act, and that was an act that said that there was just one company, the Stationers' Company, that was licensed by law from the king to publish. So everyone who wanted to publish had to go through that company. So you had a very effective tool of controlling the market and controlling what is being published. So that was in essence a tool of censorship. Now, what happened in 1695 is that Parliament failed to renew this. This was an act that wasn't perpetual, but that had to be renewed every couple of years. So in 1695 they failed to renew that, and suddenly there wasn't any censorship. The market was open. There wasn't a monopoly on publishing anymore. Anyone could publish, and there was no effective way to control the market. So obviously lawmakers try to make amends and try to find new ways of controlling the market. But they didn't just reinstate censorship, but on the contrary, what they basically came up with was a copyright law. Because the stationers, which is basically the publishers, argued for this licensing act, and they were using copyright reasons. They were saying we need this because otherwise we can't be safe from piracy, from other people just printing our text, and we won't make any money from our text. So lawmakers started to make amends to that, and that basically was the first copyright law, and that was the Statute of Anne of 1710. This is the original publication of the law. So this, in essence, is the first copyright law in European history. There were challenges to this, there were changes to this, so it really develops over the course of the 18th century into the notion that we have nowadays of intellectual property. But what that meant is that it made, on the one hand, it made publishing more securely profitable. You knew if you bought the copyright, you could sue other people who were just pirating your work. But it also meant a strengthening of the rights of authors who could demand money for the copyright, because that was a thing now. So all of these things lead to the emergence of professional authors who actually manage, by the sale of the text that they're writing, to live. And this is something that we have for the first time on a broad scale. I tried to show in some of the biographies of other authors from earlier times how they had to struggle to survive because of the lack of such a financially viable market. So what we experience here is really what we could call a professionalization of authorships. Authors become professionals, and that means a fundamental shift away from the system that used to guarantee the financing of art, and that was patronage, to professionalism. Difficult word. So really, we are seeing the end of the system of patronage. And there is one figure in the 18th century that stands for many things, and this is a good reason to introduce him here, because he also stands as kind of a symbolic figure for this shift away from the patron, the aristocratic patron, to the booksellers as sort of the more reliable patrons, the more reliable guarantors of writing. And this is Samuel Johnson. Now Johnson, we could say, is the most important literary figure in the second half of the 18th century. He's probably a little bit more difficult to get because you don't have an easily accessible text to really understand what Johnson is all about. Where if you want to know about Swift, you can start reading Modest Proposal, and then you read Gulliver's Travels, and then you have a very good idea of Swift. Johnson's work is more diverse. He wrote a lot. He did write one novel, a philosophical novel, that's still very readable, but he also wrote poetry. But he's most well known as a literary critic, writing essays, biographical essays, critical essays, and so on. So really, he is sort of the inventor of literary criticism in the 18th century. And he wrote constantly in order to make money. He didn't have a patron, he wasn't rich, so he had to make copy. He had to produce text that would sell in any way. And one of those ventures that he was all about, so these are his state of life. And yes, I forgot just to mention that Johnson was considered so important for a long time that the second half of the 18th century is often referred to as the Age of Johnson. We don't do that so much anymore in literary histories, to name them after people, but it's just an indication of the importance of Johnson. So what Johnson did in 1755 is that he agreed to take the commission of creating a dictionary of the English language. So there was dissatisfaction with the dictionaries that existed, and there was a group of booksellers who asked Johnson to write such a dictionary for the sum of 1,500 guinea. That doesn't sound all that much, but it's equivalent to about 250,000 pound of today's money. So it was a very, very substantial sum. And Johnson said, yeah, I'm going to do this. It's going to take me 3 years, and you can live comfortably for 3 years on that sum of money. It actually took him 9 years to complete the work, but he did it. And this work was an immensely important undertaking until the completion of the Oxford Dictionary some 173 years later. Johnson's was seen as the preeminent English dictionary. In fact, in his own time, he was often referred to as Dictionary Johnson because of that. So that was a large undertaking. Now, traditionally, what you did with such a thing is you went to a patron to ask for support, and this is what he did as well. So he went to Lord Chesterfield, and Chesterfield gave him £10 at the beginning of the project, which, if you just put that in relation to the £1,500 that he got from the booksellers, you can see kind of that was just sort of a gesture. And then after Johnson, after these 9 years of really, really, really hard labor, when it was finished, Chesterfield did another thing that was common for a patron, that he would recommend the work. So he wrote two essays in a magazine called The World that recommended the dictionary. Um, and Johnson, who had originally uh, asked Chesterfield for that, and he sat in his anteroom waiting for an audience and waiting for him to ask him for this support. But now that he had finished this book and he had gotten the money, he kind of grumbled at the condescension of these letters. So he wrote a letter in return to Chesterfield, and he published that. And this letter was basically rejecting the help of Chesterfield, and it has been called the death knell of patronage. So here we have him, Johnson, um, sitting here, sort of grumblingly in this ante room of the aristocrat, waiting with all the other fawning people to get the attention of the great lord. But here we have the reaction of Johnson. 7 years, my lord, have now passed since I waited in your outward rooms, or was repulsed from your door, during which time I have been pushing on my work through difficulties of which it is useless to complain, and have brought it at last to the verge of publication, without one act of assistance, one word of encouragement, or one smile of favour. Such treatment I did not expect, for I have never had a patron before. Is not a patron, my lord, one who looks with unconcern on a man struggling for life in the water, and when he has reached ground encumbers him with help? The notice which you have been pleased to take of my labours, these are the essays that Chesterfield published. The notice that you have been pleased to take of my labours, had it been early, had been kind, but it has been delayed till I am indifferent and cannot enjoy it, till I am solitary and cannot impart it, till I am known and do not want it. And we have another image of a grumbling Johnson leaving the premises of Chesterfield. And now he is known and he doesn't want the help anymore. And indeed, he does become known. It actually becomes his age and not the age of Chesterton. So this is when authors assume a kind of self-confidence as well that hadn't existed in previous periods. But of course, this development didn't go uncontested. Not everyone's just celebrated the fact that people now can become authors and become independent by writing and publishing and selling. And in fact, there was a lot of anxiety about this circumstance that everyone now can become a writer, and that is encapsulated in this term of the hack writer. Now, hack, the term is derived from hackney, a hackney coach, which is basically a person whose services may be for hire, and that was the idea here. Here is a writer who doesn't write because of art or because of convictions or deeply felt whatever, but rather someone just writes for money. So someone who writes like a manufacturer, and with a disregard for what he produces, which means that aesthetic standards are replaced by commercial success. And this is the places we'll see where this happens is called Grub Street. So here you have a contemporary depiction of such a hack writer in William Hogarth's print, The Distressed Poet from 1736, where you have the writer who constantly has to scribble in order to pay for his life and for his wife and so on. And he's living, as you can see, in a garret, in a sort of reconverted attic space, in very dire circumstances. And many poets, successful poets, made fun of that kind of writers, and were also concerned that what they would churn out is actually not the highest form of literature. So in a way, this is where the whole critique of the commercialization of art that we have to this day, where this comes from. And this is Grub Street. Grub Street is was a street in London, doesn't exist anymore, but it was a street that was famous for its concentration of such ramshackle living quarters. So we can just imagine our distressed poet living in one of those upper story places. So hack writers lived there, but also low-end publishers, booksellers, but also coffee houses and brothels. So it was really a very disreputable street that happened to also be the main street for publishers of cheap literature. So that's why it became sort of a byword for commercial, low, mean productions in literature. Johnson himself, in the dictionary, his own dictionary, he included Grub Street, and he described it in this way: originally the name of a street much inhabited by writers of small histories, dictionaries, and temporary poems, whence any mean production is called Grub Street. So this is a term that you will hear referred to often in satires on literature of the time. And this distrust in the Grub Street production, the commercialization of the book market, but also the general spirit of satirical attacks and counterattacks actually led to what, in my opinion, is one of the greatest literary productions of the 18th century, a poem called The Dunciad that was written by Alexander Pope. And because this is such a great work, but also a work that is highly inaccessible to readers nowadays, I want to introduce you to that in another video.